Today's webinar is Illinois ready for a food scrap ban? We have a number of wonderful expert folks giving us some experience from out of state. I do want to let everybody know that the Illinois Recycling Foundation is a 501c3, and we have a board of directors that's quite diverse. We have members who are composters, we have members who are government, we have members that are in textile, electronic, construction and demolition, and paint recycling. So along with college and university members, nonprofit organizations, we strive to provide information to everybody that wants to recycle, reduce waste, reuse, and compost. And we've been doing that for 43 years. Please keep yourself muted during the presentation, and know that this presentation will be available to view afterwards, and there will be a link on the Illinois Recycling website. Just a little more about us. As I mentioned, we're a 501c3 educational organization. We're dedicated to waste reduction, reuse, recycling, supporting markets for recycled content materials. Members come from a variety of disciplines, and they come together to seek solutions to challenges impacting this mission. We express our concerns to state agencies and political leadership when necessary. We welcome members of industry, government, educational institution, and nonprofits that share our goals. We have been around for over 40 years as the collective voice of recycling in Illinois. All members attend webinars free of charge. There are no fees for job postings. Employees may also attend webinars at no additional cost. All members are listed on our website directory, which is our second most used page of our website, where people come looking for services. We have monthly emails that cover current topics impacting recycling and composting. The newsletter features at least one member, usually more than one. Member activities are highlighted in our social media, and all members are also members of the National Recycling Coalition. Individual memberships start as low as $120, so basically 2 cups of coffee at your local coffee folks, and you can do that once a month and join. So very reasonable. And then we also have a very low government nonprofit rate, and it's still very reasonable from what I hear from our businesses, as I'm a government person, so I'll take their word for it, for business members as well. For those who really want to step up, we do have a benefactor membership, and that really does help us fund things like this. So coming our annual in-person conference, we have a 3-day event this year. It's going to the Bloomington Normal area. It will be 15 sessions. There will be an awards lunch, and find out and learn from others that are doing programs you'd like to try. We're very, very excited. We have a number of early sponsors. They're listed on the right, and we cannot thank them enough. So I would like to turn this over actually to John Lardner, who's been very instrumental in putting this together. He's one of our board members and has been involved with our organization easily as long as I have, which is over 30 years. So John, if you would take this on and introduce each of the speakers you were able to secure for today.
Okay, thank you, Marta. We're going to, just as a brief overview of what we're going to do today, Matt Carmel is going to start us off, kind of give us a national perspective on food waste bans, and then we're going to go to the legislative efforts of 2 states, Maryland and New Jersey. And then following that, we're going to have a presentation by Haller in Maryland, get their perspective. And finally, lastly, a state that's been implementing their food scrap ban in phases over the last 6 to 7 years, Vermont. Anxious to see how that's going. It's kind of a mature program almost at this point. So starting off is Matt Carmel. He provides comprehensive legal assistance to composters and other members of the organics recycling industry. He's a principal at Offutt Kerman, a fast-growing full-service law firm in the United States, and he is chair of their environmental and sustainability law group. In addition to composters, he represents compostable products manufacturers, food upcycling companies, renewable energy developers, Fortune 100 companies, and individuals in matters relating to environment and sustainability. He's a contributing editor to Biocycle magazine and helped found the New Jersey Composting Council and its Advocacy and Market Development Committee. So Matt, anxious to hear what you have to say.
Thanks so much, John. So let's get right to the slides, right? So next slide, and we can go right into the main slides, I think, of this. Let's see. So Offutt Kerman's a full-service law firm. As John was saying, we have 19 offices, 280 attorneys. We're across the country. This isn't the slide you care about. Next slide, please. More of our practice areas. We do everything, but I specifically do a lot.
I feel like this one isn't.
Industry.
Whatever.
Next slide again. This will all be in the record for you guys. And one more. Perfect. No, you can skip my bio. John did a good job covering it. I'm sure we'll have the slides for anyone else who's interested. So let's get right into why we're here. Okay. There are a variety of different organics recycling laws that have been enacted across the United States. Center for Ecotechnologies has put out some great resources on this. I've split it out into 4 different categories, themes in these laws in different jurisdictions. So one, you have disposal bans, which are laws that say you cannot put this organic material into a landfill. Other is a mandatory recycling law, which says this group of generators, waste generators, people who produce waste, must recycle their waste in a certain kind of way. Now, neither of these laws, disposal bans and municipal recycling laws, are unique to organics. They got their start in more historical recyclables, plastic, metal, those kinds of things. But we're seeing these tools be used for organics as well. And there's a lot of differences between disposal bans and mandatory recycling laws. One obviously is negative, don't do this. The other is affirmative, you must do this. The other category of law that I have on this list is municipal planning laws. These laws are similar to mandatory recycling laws in that they say, we are going to achieve a certain rate of recycling by doing X, Y, and Z. But mandatory recycling laws tend to be very prescriptive. This type of generator who meets this threshold has to dispose of this waste in this way, or recycle this waste in this way. Municipal planning laws can be much more flexible. They say, okay, we're not going to create a statewide policy necessarily. We're not going to define who the subject generators are, or what the subject waste is, or what the thresholds are. We're going to say municipalities use whatever tools you'd like, or whatever suite of tools you'd like, and develop a policy that is going to achieve a certain recycling goal, usually. And so these laws attack it a different way. They provide more flexibility, but there's also more of a tax on local resources because the local government needs to figure out how to do these different things. And then there's food scrap donation laws. And these laws are sometimes combined with the foregoing laws. And they say, we're not just going to address recycling, we're going to tell you what to do with food scraps, if they have value, to be sent to, if they are edible or have other value, we're going to tell you different things. So there are different pros and cons to each of these. There are different costs. It's very easy to say what cannot go in the landfill. If you were going to say, that can be a very short law of what can and cannot go into a landfill. When you get into a mandatory recycling law, it needs to be a lot more complex. Municipal planning laws also can be much simpler. So you're getting the sense of there's different themes and trends that come up when you're focused on these different types of laws. New Jersey, New York, a lot of the Northeast states have adopted mandatory recycling laws, but some of them are recognizing that those laws don't necessarily go far enough. And so they're considering other laws. And I won't take too much thunder from Isaac as he gets into New Jersey's examples, but New Jersey is one of those states that is grappling with, okay, we had some historical disposal bans, then we have a mandatory recycling law, and maybe now we're going to have a municipal planning law, and how do all of those pieces work together? So these also, the point I'm making now is these aren't necessarily exhaustive. They can work together, or I would say they aren't mutually exclusive. They can work together. And so it's important as you're designing whatever policy you're designing to focus on these examples from other states, which, as I said, there's some great resources out there that walk through exactly what other states have done, including from the Center for Ecotechnologies. And I'm going to highlight a couple of specific issues on the next slide. So I'm focusing in here on a mandatory recycling law, and looking at some of the issues that I've seen representing businesses and composting associations and companies in connection with mandatory recycling laws in states I've been involved with. Some of the major issues are, one, a radius. Mandatory recycling laws usually have a requirement saying this generator, if they're within X miles of a certain facility, has to recycle their food waste or organic material, or however it's defined. That radius changes. If you change that radius, you change the amount of facilities that are going to be subject, because the radius comes from a disposal facility, a recycling facility, a composting facility. So New York actually did a study prior to the adoption of their policy where they said, okay, if we draw the radius at 20 miles, this is the amount of the state that's going to be covered by existing resources. This is where it's going to be. And if we did it by 50 miles, this is how it would be covered. This is how it was going to be. And so they actually did a cost benefit analysis of the different radiuses to determine what the right one for New York was, what balanced the right causes for New York. So I commend that study from NYSERDA to anyone who's considering this policy in Illinois. But beyond just the distance, it's how you calculate the distance too. Some states have gone with road miles. Some states have gone with, on a map as the crow flies. So it's if my home is 9 miles as the crow flies from here, I may have to drive 12 miles, going around different roads. So that road miles is harder to calculate, I would say, and not exactly standard. So I certainly prefer the certainty of, as the crow flies. Threshold is also very important. This refers to the amount of waste that a generator needs to generate to be put into the mandatory recycling program. There's usually a tonnage limit for when they're a large enough generator that they get caught up. And some of these policies scale down over time to smaller generators. Some of them it's through subsequent legislation, but that's something that's really important to think about. In New Jersey, after the law was passed, there were a lot of comments from stakeholders that the threshold should be reduced, but that couldn't be done without another piece of legislation, and no one had the political capital or interest in doing that immediately after we had just passed our version of the mandatory recycling law. So that's something that's important to think about. What counts as food waste? Pre-post-consumer issues. In New Jersey, the food scraps law is post-consumer, meaning it's after a consumer has touched it. Now that also can give rise to certain ambiguities as when is something post-consumer? Is it when a consumer has actually touched it? Or is it when it has been offered to the consumer? And that may seem like a small issue, and it is, but the important thing is to think we're evolving in this legislation as we adopt it. And take the example of like a deli bar at a Whole Foods or a ShopRite, or I'm not sure what grocery stores you have predominantly in Illinois. Someone can drop that in the chat, and I'll include that next time. But a deli bar, has that been offered? If no one's put a spoon in it, or if it's leftovers that aren't on someone's plate, how is that covered? And that's not something that's usually addressed at the statutory level, but can be addressed at regulatory level. And so it's just something to think about, but it makes a big difference at the broader scope pre-post consumer of how you calculate who is subject to the law. Obviously, a big issue is residential or commercial. What are you trying to address? In my experience, commercial organics recycling laws, mandatory recycling laws focus on commercial, and some of the other tools are used to address residential. But there's nothing stopping a mandatory recycling law from focusing on residential. Something that came up in New York's law, and especially specifically the comments afterwards, was, okay, you've got a bunch of different organics recycling facilities. You've got anaerobic digestion, you've got composting, you've got vermicomposting, you've got different things. Is there a hierarchy? Should there be a hierarchy? Should things be diverted to one use over another? This was something that was commented on significantly in New York State's implementation, but the statute did not provide for any sort of hierarchy. And so there was nothing that the implementing agency could do about it. They just said there's no hierarchy. It can go to any organics recycling facility. Now, I think that's probably the right result, but there were a lot of people who were concerned about that. And then, another issue is what counts as an authorized facility under your law. Now, is it only the big facilities, or are you including your smaller scale facilities, your on-farm composting? What is an organics recycling facility that triggers the radius determination we were talking about at first? In New Jersey, it's just certain facilities. So there's a lot of exempt and research facilities that do not trigger the law. And I don't know that that's really hurting those facilities, but it just doesn't look as good on the map when you see what the facilities are that are covered. Food scrap donation we've covered. Pre-processing impact, this is just like a weird thing that came up in New York a little bit, which was when you have massive manufacturing facilities and they do pre-processing, whether that's dehydration or sorting, how does that impact their threshold? And how do sort of these pre-processing devices that can separate out different materials and possibly discharge some of those materials to a sewer system, how does that get calculated under a waste threshold perspective? And New York made certain decisions about how they were going to calculate that. And there's also other provisions that can be included. There's lots of other compost supporting legislation, procurement policies, state purchase incentives, different ancillary items, task forces, and you see across examples that a lot of these mandatory recycling laws, as they move forward, get some other related compost legislation attached, because it's a chance to pass everything in some kind of omnibus mechanism. So that's sort of, a couple of the highlights and the different policies that we've seen. And I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. I think we have one more slide which explains that we're going to do questions after all the speakers have talked.
Well, thank you, Matt. And covered a lot of information there for us to consider in Illinois to digest. And I know there's some people have given thought to some of that, but obviously it's not translated into action. And that's what Isaac Brewer is going to talk about in New Jersey, how they implemented their organics diversion in recycling legislation into their state. So Isaac will be our next speaker. He's vice president of the New Jersey Composting Council. He holds an MBA from Boston University, with concentrations in finance and energy and environmental sustainability. As a professional, he's completed projects investigating investments into compost and anaerobic digestion, exploring regulatory and market drivers for successful programs, both on behalf of national impact investors and small composting businesses. He's also completed the New Jersey Compost Operators and USCC Principles of Practices of Compost Manufacturing course, and he serves as a leader for the Young Professionals Program for the U.S. Composting Council, for those of you on this webinar that are young into this industry, Isaac's your guy here. So Isaac, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So yeah, I'm Vice President of the NJCC, and let's hop right into it. So we're a nonprofit affiliate of the U.S. Composting Council. And yeah, what are we going to talk about in my short little talk, hopefully? We're going to talk about New Jersey's food scrap law and what it looks like. We're going to talk a little bit about how it got passed, because that can always be an interesting process. We're going to talk about some learnings in terms of how can you make an impact on the legislation, including food waste bans. And then what's been the impact of the ban and how we're moving forward, given that. So we started in New Jersey with S2307, which was to reduce food waste by 50% by 2030. And it included the creation of a food waste council and a food waste task force. And they've released a draft plan, and it very much emphasizes source reduction and donation, but there's really no discussion of what happens when you can't source reduce or donate. And, you know, it's unclear how much this has been implemented, but I would say that, you know, any plan that you're moving forward does need to at least think about what reducing food waste would look like, and should always be, you know, the first thing that you're looking at. So then we move forward with the food waste mandate that Matt had alluded to in his presentation. So it aims to address food waste by requiring commercial and institutional establishments that generate, and this is the 52 tons or more of food waste per year. And again, he talked about that radius. In New Jersey, it's 25 miles of food waste, of a food waste facility. And that's a authorized food waste facility. And we'll come back to that. There's also an exemption if the cost is 10% greater compared to regular disposal. That went into effect in October of 2021. And New Jersey was just the 6th state to enact such a law. So who is required to start diverting from landfills? It's this whole list of folks here. But as you can see, they're mostly commercial generators. So we have not really touched residential in any way at this point. So let's talk a little bit about the process. It was a lengthy process. It was started by our recycling association before the composting council was in existence. And yeah, so I mean, obviously that's a long time in the making. It was opposed by landfills and incinerators, but you know, you would kind of expect that because we're saying don't bring feedstocks to, you know, and that's potentially, at least in their minds, less revenue. And it was also opposed by generator groups like the Food Council, who were thinking that was going to impose greater costs on their members. It was supported from environmental groups. And interestingly, if you ever follow our legislature, when a bill comes up before the for a final vote, it is very rarely discussed. It's just voted on. But with this bill, there was a lot of floor discussion, and we needed to, you know, get it over the finish line. So we played a role in that, but there was also an environmental justice law that said if you're going to do, you know, certain siting of facilities, and Matt can talk a lot more intelligently on this EJ law than I can, but you know, it was contingent on passing that environmental justice law and passed with like a 1-person vote. So it was, you know, very contentious, and it called for an 18-month implementation. So what did we learn? It always helps to find I should say policy person. I'm going to have to update these slides. But, you know, having someone like Matt around, who was very instrumental in helping us with our advocacy committee, having consultants, working with the Recycling Association, contacting, the big companies and things like that. You really want to build a group of people who are pushing for the environmentally sustainable solutions. Again, our advocacy group, which Matt helped found, and then I am now in charge of, we really, when you have an organization that's calling your state legislature and making some noise, even if the group isn't as big as it sounds, it makes a difference. And so we went down and we testified in committee sessions, and, not just about this bill, but about other bills. And we go and we talk to people. And that's something that early on I was pretty hesitant to do, but that's what you need to do, is get out there and talk to the chief of staff, talk to the legislative aides, talk to the, sometimes because of their title, they can seem like kind of imposing people, but usually they're pretty nice and at least willing to listen to you. Sometimes they may not do what you want, but so be it. And learn who your legislatures listen to. In the state of New Jersey, our Department of Environmental Protection is very influential, and on things like this, I think that makes a lot of sense. But it's important to know where they're going to stand and be able to work with them. It's important as an organization like this that you have some sort of tracking software in place to know, because at least in New Jersey, bills come up at the very last minute, and if you're not aware, they might just come flying by past you if you're not, directly talking with them on a day-to-day basis. So those are some lessons we learned. So what about some updates? So how are things going since we passed that bill? One of the things it called for was a food waste recycling market development council. This is something we think is really important because, we already have a lot of leaf and yard waste facilities here in New Jersey, and their product is sometimes really good, sometimes not as much so. And they're not always sure what to do with the end product. And there are a million different uses for a quality compost. But, if you don't know what to do with it, or the markets haven't been properly developed in order to do things like, there's a provision in the bill that the DOT, Department of Transportation, has to, prefer compost. So, we really need to have more work done in terms of, again, developing both the infrastructure and the end product. Well, they finally started meeting this year after the bill was, ready in 2021. So it's taken a while, but it's an important step that's finally happening. And, that's something that we had to pressure them to finally implement. There's still no final regulations from our Department of Environmental Protection. They're still asking questions like, what's plate waste? Which is, something that I don't think is rocket science, but they're taking, they're careful measures to ensure that they properly define it. There is very limited food waste recycling capacity here in New Jersey. And I think I put in a slide about that, so I won't harp on it too much, but we need a lot more. There's currently no incentives for composters. So whether you're a generator, a hauler, or a composter, in New York State, they have, they'll cover part of your costs if you want to start, diverting your food waste, or if you want to open a municipal facility. In New Jersey, we don't have any of those things. We have seen some counties putting out RFPs, and one was in fact awarded recently, and another is hopefully going to be sending out an RFP in the near future. And that was in part based on this bill. They said, okay, well, these, we're going to have to eventually start to do this. So let's get ahead of it and start providing that infrastructure. And so, a nice AD facility is going to be built by one of the counties. And now we have other bills that are coming in place, including a new bill to limit food waste to landfills. So yeah, some of our issues are we have a lack of infrastructure. The cost to set up, for generators and hauling costs are high. We have one facility that is accepting food waste at $120 a ton when the trash is being processed at like 100 or 110, and they're like, well, it's tough to make the finances work. Contamination is always an issue. We have a lack of a tiered permitting system. It's one size fits all in New Jersey. And there's a lack of education on environmental and business benefits of really doing that. And that's part of what we work on, is trying to make sure people are aware of that kind of thing. So again, we have currently 2 fully permitted facilities in New Jersey. And those are the only facilities that trigger our waste law. We have 2 that are permitted but do not currently operate. And then we have others that are under different licenses, which do not fully trigger the food waste law. So when you look at New Jersey, all the way in the middle there, you see where we stand compared to all of these other states. And so if you want to have an effective mandate and you're required to take it to a fully permitted facility that is within 25 road miles, that's going to leave out a lot of different people if you only have 2 facilities. So again, one of the things that we need to address is permitting. We have very limited exemptions for food waste. There's no tiered structure. A community garden is treated the same way as a landfill. So if you had a system like this in my backyard, you would and wanted to accept from other places, like I can do it my own food waste, but if I want to take it from a community from somewhere else, I have to be permitted the same way as essentially a landfill, and that can get really expensive.
Isaac, in the interest of time, can you about 5 more minutes before we have to move on to our next speakers?
Sure. Yeah, I can wrap up
Right, thank you.
pretty quickly. So I'll just say that so local rule is not a thing, but it's kind of a thing. So that's basically what I'm saying there is you don't have to get local zoning and things like that, but you do have to go through the county, and the county planning process does not require you to be put into the plan. And so that's something we're working on, is to create a bill that will require counties to start planning for their food waste, which then they can no longer say, hey, we don't have to accept your facility, because otherwise then they have no plan. So I think I'll basically, I don't recall if I have so many more slides, but I think that's, we built a coalition of a lot of different stakeholders, and we worked on a number of different bills. We're working. Education is going to be a huge part of it. Our regulators have not necessarily been to a ton of compost sites. Our environmental profits love composting, but they don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of how to do it. Our county planners need assistance in terms of telling them how to effectively, reduce and put, plans in place to handle food waste. And so education is going to be a huge part of that, in addition to the legislative and regulatory development. These are some of the bills we're working on. Again, I referenced that County Food Recovery Planning Act, which does include now recycling as well as food recovery, which is something we pushed for. There's a community garden exemption, a regional school bills exemption. And I'll leave it there, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Isaac. We're going to move on to our next presentation, going down, heading south from New Jersey down to the state of Maryland, where we're going to have Emily Ransom talk about their efforts at food recovery in bans. She's the state director of the National Clean Water Action nonprofit organization. She grew up in Maryland, where she cultivated fond memories of playing in the streams and rivers in central Maryland. She received her Master's of Science from Cornell University, studying conflict resolution and community-based natural resource management. Emily cut her advocacy teeth with Bike Maryland, working with state and local governments, businesses, and community activists throughout the state to promote a bike-friendly Maryland. As the Maryland Program Director, Emily heads legislative work in Annapolis and works on the local level for policies and practices that protect our precious waters. So Emily, go right ahead.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks everyone for having me. So Emily Ranson with Clean Water, here to talk about Maryland's organic diversion bill. So the basics of this bill, the way we designed it is it uses a phased in approach. So the bill now, as of January, covers large generators who are producing over 2 tons of waste a week. And then next year, it will phase down to large generators who are producing 1 ton of waste a week. How it's set up is if the generator triggers the bill, then they must divert from landfill or incinerator, and they have multiple options for disposal. We went with the 30-mile radius. The trigger is an organics recycling facility. And we also have the 10% waiver if the cost is higher than current disposal fees. And the organics recycling facility must be willing and able to take all of the generator's waste. We did go with an explicit exemption for restaurants, and a lot of that is due to our timing. So this bill passed in 2021, and it would have been a significant barrier to the bill of addressing, having it cover restaurants as they were just emerging from all of the shutdowns in 2020. And also Maryland has very few restaurants who are producing over 1 ton of waste a week. So that is why we went with just a basic exemption. So the next slide is Maryland is a relatively small state. So this is a map produced by our Department of the Environment, and it shows the 30-mile radius around Maryland organic recycling facilities, as well as Virginia and Pennsylvania's. And so for the most part, like a lot of our state is covered by this. And that's just a quirk of our unique geography. So then where it can be disposed, if you are a generator who is required to divert from landfill or incinerator, you have a couple of options. And the bill actually spells this out in order. So while we don't have an explicit hierarchy or preference, there was a lot of negotiations that went to creating, the order of the list. And so that is, of course, reducing, donating for human consumption, on-site recycling, use for agriculture, including animal feed, and then, of course, off-site organic recycling. Maryland does have a definition for organics recycling, and that is both composting as well as anaerobic digestion. So we, of course, had a lot of issues that we had to face and we had to deal with. The first one was it is one of the things that helped derail the bill in 2020, and that is the issue of rats and smell. So one thing that I found for sure, and I imagine many other people have a very similar experience, is legislators do not understand composting. And so what we kept getting back is, well, if we have a bin of only food waste, that is going to send out the rat signal And every single rat in the mid-Atlantic is going to move to Maryland because now there is a smorgasbord of food. And so we spent a lot of time basically educating legislators to explain that as the status quo is right now, all of that food waste is just in a mixed waste bin. It's not like this organics diversion, the source separation, none of that is creating new food waste. It's just creating a new system, so it's going into a separate bin. Then exempting restaurants, of course, was a significant issue. And then there were concerns about the 30-mile radius and whether or not Maryland had sufficient, processing facilities to make the bill even matter. So we both had, on one hand, convincing legislators that the bill was feasible, it was attainable, but also convincing legislators that it had a big enough impact to, be important, to be meaningful, to actually do something about the waste, be a climate benefit, be an environmental benefit, or something like that. There was also a pretty significant, actually back to the lack of understanding about how waste works. And so Isaac mentioned, the importance of the coalition, the importance of having somebody tracking. And this was one of the roles I played in this coalition is, hi, my name is Emily and I'm a registered lobbyist. So I was the lobbyist who was basically running down problems, running down the questions, and then I had to have access to an amazing coalition who could swoop in and answer the questions. Because all it would take is a lobbyist for like the waste haulers or somebody else to say, well, we're going to have trucks filled with compost circling around the state because there's nowhere to take the waste. And that suddenly became, a huge barrier. And the state was looking at requiring that all compost facilities create contracts, and everybody was going to have to be governed by these contracts, because if not, we're going to have just compost trucks. They will never find a home for all of this waste, and it's going to be a disaster. And so fortunately, how Maryland was and is still operating is a lot of those discussions happen in subcommittee. And I called Ben, who's going to be talking next, and freaking out saying, Ben, we need you. And he had to take time out of his day basically to give a 90-second, description of, this is how composting works. This is how waste works. No, we're not going to have dump trucks full of food waste circling around the state, causing endless problems. So having both the person in the legislature who is able to identify those problems, and then having the coalition, the support, the technical expertise to answer those questions. Because somebody like me, they say, well, Emily, you're an environmentalist, you're from Clean Water Action. It has a lot more weight when it is a literal compost hauler who's able to give them assurances that we are not causing a disaster. So for everybody else in the legislature, we created these fact sheets. And so, this is an example of one where literally I needed to show them. And it was, again, quick emailing, texting, calling the coalition saying, I need pictures, I need visuals, because the legislators are freaking out. They have no idea what this is going to look like. And so this is one that Waste Neutral sent me, which is, a photo of what it looks like and with a description. And so legislators can see, oh yeah, this looks like trash, but the bags are green. So it's just a little bit different. And then the next one is, look, it's just another normal trash can. This is normal. This isn't, redesigning everything. This is, well, let's just have a trash can that says no trash, and it's your compost can. It's just the word that's different. Slightly different stuff goes in it. It is not a, it is not a disaster. We are all going to be okay. So then, of course, not only do we have to face the bargaining with the opposition, the bargaining with the legislators, but then there were a lot of advocate concerns. And a big one, and I'm really interested to hear from Vermont when they go, is we were very concerned about, would this legislation incentivize only large facilities with depackagers? And so what we really hoped with this legislation, and the jury's still out on it because it went into effect in January. So, you can't really make any great judgments. Is it working? Is it not working? I don't know. It's been 5 months. But so we did add language to require source separation at the front end. How well that's going to be enforced, we will see. But then in 2023, so the last 2 years, 22 and 23, we were working on expanding Maryland's on-farm compost permit exemption. So, New Jersey, you all said you don't really have a tier system. In Maryland, we do. But for small food waste facilities, the only options were to become a fully permitted facility or to use a permit exemption for under 5,000 square feet if you were composting food scraps. But how Maryland worked is we did have a compost exemption for farms up to 40,000 square feet, but they were not allowed to bring in food scraps from offsite. So what we decided to do and ultimately passed is we expanded that to 10,000 square feet. So it's not on par with the manure composting on farms, but at the very least, farms will now be able to accept food scraps and will be able to have up to 10,000 square feet of active compost piles. So trying to make it so, farmers are able to benefit from this new food waste recycling program, that it's an option for smaller compost facilities, really trying to make it so all of the investment, all of the incentives don't go to the really, really large facilities. So, that's my summary of Maryland. Excited to answer questions at the end and excited to hear from everyone else. So thank you.
Well, and thank you, Emily, for helping us to understand what you have to go through to get that legislation passed in Maryland. And next up, we're going to get a instead of a and nonprofits, what they went through. We're going to look at what the actual private group had to do in terms of getting this legislation passed in Maryland. Presenting will be Ben Perry. He's the CEO of Compost Crew, business executive and entrepreneur fighting to protect the health of our planet. Compost Crew provides composting and food scrap collection service to nearly 10,000 commercial, residential, and municipal customers in Maryland, Virginia, and DC. The company operates several distributed composting systems. Its compost outposts in partnership with area farms and municipalities process high quality compost and build food system resiliency. He's been an advocate and testified for several bills that support composting, including Maryland House Bill 264 and Senate Bill 483, which requires large waste generators to separate food residuals from other solid waste and ensure that food residuals are diverted for final disposal in refuse disposal systems. Ben, thank you for presenting and look forward to hearing your perspective here.
All right, thank you so much. Emily did a great job of highlighting the details of the Maryland mandatory recycling law and talking about some of the, how it was implemented. So what I'll do, I'll give a quick overview of who we are, who Compost Crew is, talk a little bit more about how we've continued to advocate for and publicize Maryland's law. And then at the end, I'll also back up and talk a little bit more about other, just thoughts on policies in general from a hauler's perspective. So Compost Crew, we're a food waste hauler, but we're also a composter. So we serve almost 10,000 businesses, homes, municipalities throughout Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Our focus is actually on decentralized composting. So we have our own turnkey modular system called the Compost Outpost, which we build on farms. And specifically, we target table crop farms so that we can build food system resiliency. And then we partner with other large compost facilities that can accept more volume. And we're lucky in Maryland, actually, because we do have a fair amount of food waste recycling infrastructure already at the time that this new law was implemented. And then one of the ideas behind the law was to help build more food waste recycling infrastructure, because there's 700,000 tons of food waste estimated around the region, and there's only a fraction of that. We have only a capacity to compost and recycle a fraction of it. So like I said, we focus on distributed composting. So we want to establish food waste recycling programs for communities, municipalities, and business. And so with our turnkey collections and turnkey distributed composting, we're able to launch a food waste recycling program for a municipality or a county within 6 months to a year. So in terms of Maryland's law, so Emily already talked about how it works. We've been working with, trying to find ways to integrate promotion of the law and build awareness among the business community in Maryland, in partnership with Maryland Department of Environment. And the MDE, Maryland Department of Environment, they've done a good job of setting up basically a food waste recycling page that provides a lot of the information about the compost, the law itself, the facilities and the infrastructure that are available. And here's a snapshot of their webpage. You can see the different announcements. Of course, front and center right now is the food residual diversion waiver application. So how do you take advantage of the loophole so that you don't have to participate on it? So that's part of the balance of implementing this. So some of the things that we've done to help, once the law went into effect at the beginning of this year, we created, posted a lot of the information on our blog and pointed to the information that Maryland Department of Environment had already built. We were planning to do our own webinar, but MDE decided to do one themselves, so we just pointed everybody to that one. The map Emily talked about, I think that map is really helpful to serve as a tool for potential customers to map out distances. If you go to the next slide, we've also done a lot to push out information on various social media platforms. So in terms of results so far, we have seen increased demand from the law since it went into effect earlier this year. It hasn't been, the phone hasn't been ringing off the hook. So I think that's a good balance, though, because the collections business has been very difficult over the past couple of years. I think it was Waste Management CEO Jim Fish who said, I can hire a $60,000 MBA all day long, but I can't find a $100,000 CDL driver. And so between that and, a lot of companies are a month to 6 months behind on their truck procurement, having too much demand too fast can be harmful to the industry. So the way that Maryland's law is, where it's phased in, there are some waivers that companies can get. You don't want the loopholes to be too large, which I'm still They may be in Maryland, especially with restaurants being exempt. I mean, that's a huge loophole. But there has to be make sure that if there is some sufficient capacity already in place, which Maryland has, and also phase in the requirements over time so that you don't have unsustainable demand early on in the process. And that's what we're seeing so far in Maryland. The other thing that I get nervous about as a hauler and a composter is laws that are too punitive can have the risk of increasing contamination. So if we say from day one, everybody must recycle all of their food, it's mandatory rather than an opt-in process to at least start the process. I worry about individuals and organizations that just aren't used to it. And if they're forced to do things right off the bat, increasing contamination, which increased costs of the process, but also decreases the quality of the finished product at the end of the day, that can be really harmful to the industry. And that last point that I made is, I think, very critical, which is part of what we're trying to do is divert waste from landfills and incinerators to protect the environment and also extend the life of those landfills and incinerators. But another huge part is that we are collecting an organic resource that can be used to recycled into valuable commodity that can improve the health of our soil. And so that should not be lost when these policies and regulations are being devised. Diversion is important, but the quality of the end product and the quality of the soil is also really important. I think just a couple other points that I'd like to make in addition to talking about just Maryland's mandatory organic recycling law. We have seen in our area grants and other methods that help overcome switching costs. So, businesses, and especially restaurants and small restaurants, are very resistant to change. They have limited budgets, they have high staff turnover, so change can be difficult. And that's why I think that grants and other incentives are really important to help overcome those switching costs, grease the wheels. Washington, D.C. has started a small grant program that has helped some restaurants and other companies get composting programs off the ground. Montgomery County, Maryland, which is right outside of Washington, D.C., that's where we are, they started a program where they will provide free composting services to businesses for a year. And then after a year, they'll hand it off to the private sector. And that is actually a really promising idea, because these types of public-private partnerships between governments who help build the awareness and get things started and then partner with the private sector to keep it going, that's important, because you want to promote and support environmental innovators like Compost Crew. We've been doing this for 12 years and we have a lot of experience. We've been able to we've gotten very good at teaching businesses and organizations, how do you source separate, and how do you start composting programs within your business. Then, we've also taken a lot of risk over those 12 years. So to get the government support to help at least get these programs started and off the ground, I mean, that's very important to have the governments and the businesses team up together on that. There's other things that we can talk about in the Q&A session. I think that at the end of the day, like Emily said, it's too early to tell whether or not, Maryland's law, what the outcomes will be of Maryland's law, but we're seeing definitely early traction without a huge flood of demand, and also, not seeing adverse effects just yet.
Well, thank you, Ben. Interesting to hit your perspective on that, and what you're finding after this legislation was passed, and your goals going forward. Moving on to our next speaker, Natasha Duarte, is going to talk about Vermont, who's been through this process for quite a while. Vermont being one of the early adapters of looking at redirecting food scraps away from landfills into composting. She's the director of the Composting Association of Vermont. She represents them in policy initiatives, develops and leads outreach and education initiatives, and promotes the production and use of compost as vital to soil health through practices that contribute to water quality, plant vigor, and environmental resilience. Natasha has extensive experience working with rural and small communities. We plan and implement solid waste management projects, developing training tools and resources, and delivering training and technical assistance. She is currently an instructor for the University of Vermont's Master Composter program and is currently leading a USDA-funded project that supports community-oriented food scrap composting on farms. She has an MS in soil science from North Carolina State University and a BA in anthropology from the University of Vermont. Natasha, thank you for participating. I look forward to hear what you have to present.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and for the opportunity to share some of Vermont's story. I'll just quickly, for folks who aren't familiar with the Composting Association of Vermont, we advocate for work to advance the value and production of high quality compost through partnerships, projects, and policies. And our mission overall is to promote the production of compost and composting as an integral link between sustainable agriculture, communities, and economies. So we're just a small member run nonprofit. Yeah, I guess that fits the small size of our state. You can go ahead to the next slide. Yeah, so there's of course a lot to talk about because we've been doing this for a while, but I'll try to just give broad brush strokes to get us going, and then we can have more discussion during the Q&A. So our Universal Recycling Law, or Act 148, passed unanimously in 2012, in part because our one operating landfill in the state, and we have no incinerators, our one landfill is filling up, right? So it was actually sort of proposed as, we either need to figure out the landfill situation or we need to figure out how to put less materials in the landfill. It effectively bans the blue bin recyclables, leaf and yard debris, clean wood, and food scraps. The goal overall is to improve the capture and diversion rates for these valuable materials and to start thinking of them as resources instead of waste. The food scrap portion of the law, which is what we're talking about today, was rolled out between 2014 and 2020. So the law passed in 2012. In 2014, the first group was the largest generator, so 2 tons per week. Were within 20 miles of a compost facility. So we had that the ban, the landfill ban is combined with that radius initially. And then every year after 2014, we basically just cut that generator load in half. So we started with 2 tons a week, and then 1 ton a week, and half a ton a week. And then in 2020, we got down to a full ban, down to the residential level. So everybody in the state of Vermont, regardless of distance from a facility. It's also important to note that the law passed without any funding attached to it. So it was really intended to send a clear signal to both private and public sectors that these materials are going to be available. And the state essentially hoped that this would provide incentive to invest in infrastructure and meet the anticipated demand. Right here is the food recovery hierarchy that is part of our law. So it's in statute. And it should look fairly familiar. You've sort of, other folks in this panel have talked about the different tiers. It is important as well to note that the source separation of organics, so compostable materials from non-compostable materials at the point of generation, is also part of the law. But then again, how well that's done comes down to outreach and education efforts effectively. Can go to the next slide. So the most recent data we have is from 2018. This is our waste composition year. So we're all looking forward to getting new data from the study that's happening this year. But essentially from the 2018 data, it's estimated that about 20% of what was being landfill was still food scraps in Vermont. So it's around 77,000 tons a year, and about half of this was residential. So just note that this data is from before the residential ban went into place. Next slide. So some of the successes that we've had, food donation into our charitable food system has nearly tripled since the law went into effect. And while waste reduction and then getting, food to hungry people is part of the organic diversion hierarchy, we really weren't necessarily prepared for that scale. And we're not really talking about this today, but a whole lot of infrastructure had to come up to speed pretty quickly because I think between 2014 and 2016, it doubled, and it's more and more is going into that. And we did not have that infrastructure set up. The number of food scrap haulers has gone up almost fourfold, which is pretty significant. In 2012, we had 12 organic food scrap haulers. We now, as of last year, had 46. 35 of those 46 are offering residential collection. So there are still some that are only servicing commercial and institutional generators, but we have a growing number of residential collections. And this is everything from 5-gallon buckets, curbside collection, to the larger totes that are put out in either neighborhoods or at condominiums or townhouse type of places. So we also have some new data from a publication that came out of some research from the University of Vermont this February, that shows that 85% of Vermonters are composting, and 61% feel that it's a moral obligation to keep food scraps out of the landfill, which is pretty significant because I think that really indicates that all of the outreach and education around the why behind keeping food scraps out of the landfill is starting to take hold. We're starting to see that really come up more. Next slide. So I had thought this morning, but it was a little too late to add. It would have been interesting to show sort of before and after maps, but these are our more current maps from our Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Environmental Conservation. The map on the left shows different types of management or diversion options. So the smaller dark green dots are all of the transfer stations across our state. And some came online sooner, but essentially as of, I would say by the end of 2020, we have just over 100 transfer stations in our state, and all of them are accepting food scraps along with trash and recycling. You can see from the blue shading across the state that that's sort of the geographic representation of where there's curbside pickup available for individual households. The purple is where there's drop off at least within 10 miles. And then there is multi-household pickup. And of course, backyard composting is happening more and more throughout the state. There is that little sort of green section of the Northeast Kingdom that really is still struggling in terms of having more comprehensive infrastructure. But there's certainly backyard composting and community scale composting. And I just want to point out that while there is some on-farm or other composting sites indicated with the green with the red in the middle, this does not represent all of the on-farm composting that's happening across our state. That's something that our Department of Environmental Conservation really only tracks some of those. And if they're certified with them, And so just to say, this is not the full picture. We actually have more community scale and on-farm scale composting that's happening throughout the state. And then the map on the right is just a sort of shows the distribution of certified food scrap management facilities. So that includes compost sites. There are some farms on there because some of them have certified with DEC as well, anaerobic digestion, and then also some transfer facilities, because we are transferring some of our organic waste now actually to a depackager AD facility in Maine. All right, so as I indicated at the beginning, the universal recycling law in Vermont was passed really without any money attached to it, so not a penny attached to implementation. But there has been significant support directed towards infrastructure development as the law has been rolling out. We don't have time to get into details of all the different funding programs. I can certainly answer more questions afterwards or offline, but I did want to share an overview of some of how implementation has been supported. We've been able to leverage both EPA and USDA funds. The state has provided over $1.5 million just since 2019, even for municipal and or solid waste management districts. In addition to these larger funding, there's been a whole host of smaller grants to schools for school compost, actually on-site school composting. There's our solid waste folks have been able to provide compost bins either free or at very low cost, so sort of subsidized bins and kitchen caddies. And then there have been a whole host of outreach and education grants, just to name a few. Additionally, several programs receive support from our Agency of Natural Resources, including the Vermont Organics Recycling Summit that the Composting Association of Vermont partners with to put that on every year. That's one of the biggest and sort of annual education and outreach events. They also support the Master Composter course through UVM Extension, which really helps building that people infrastructure in our communities throughout our state. And so all of this goes towards supporting and or the development of a culture of this is what we do with our organic residuals, as opposed to landfilling. And then there's extensive technical assistance provided for composters, including an annual compost operator training, which is, I think, like $40 or something. It's very accessible. So all of these programs, the Master Composter program is $50. So for Vermont residents. And so really working hard to make all of this information as accessible and affordable to as many people as possible has really been key. So some of the challenges, and I had to chuckle when one of the earlier panelists said, you know, usually things just pass through the legislation, but, you know, somehow when you're talking about food scraps, all these contentious conversations start happening. For us, there have been a number of iterations around the hauler requirement. The original law passed basically saying haulers are required to offer organic collection. That was pushed back against pretty hard. There were a lot of concerns around residential pickup in particular, even though, you know, the pushback sort of started in 2012 and continued at every opportunity to sort of push on this one point. But then also route density, especially in rural areas. It just didn't seem feasible to require this. Where we've landed on and what the current iteration is that haulers are still required to offer food scrap collection for commercial customers, but for residents, there only needs to be, they only need to offer the service for apartments or condominiums or townhouses of units of 4 or more. And there only has to be one hauler servicing that area. And so our DEC keeps track of that. And as long as one hauler is covering it, the others can, but they don't have to. And then a list is maintained. We also have fast trash or bag drop haulers, which are essentially mobile solid waste collection operations. which are required to offer food scrap collection at all of those because it's essentially a drop-off site. It's just sort of a pop-up drop-off site. Compost markets, you've already heard a little bit about that. That has been, it's definitely been slower to develop. And this really gets at that idea that we're not just diverting food scraps for the sake of diverting, but it is producing, can, and ideally is producing a quality compost soil amendment product at the end that has value. And the pandemic has actually shifted compost sales quite a bit, but I feel there's really a lot more work that our state could do to increase municipal procurement and get compost and compost-based products into road and stormwater projects and used more broadly. There are, of course, challenges with human-animal interactions, whether it's the rats that Emily mentioned, but we're up in bear country here. And so that is really where the outreach and education comes in to help people understand how to compost safely, which can be done. It's just a matter of managing those odors and understanding that browns or carbon are a part of the mix. There, of course, with increased diversion comes increased opportunity for contamination. And along with the rest of the world, it seems this heightened sensitivity and concern around PFAS or PFOAs and microplastics getting in. And this relates to some extent to policies around the management of packaged foods. You can go to the next slide. So I wanted to just talk about this a little bit because this sort of, as Vermont is iterating and we're sort of maturing a little bit in our program, we're coming across some issues that maybe other states are, or maybe you're still on the cusp and just getting your programs off the ground. But from the 2018 data that we do have, about 38% or 29,000 tons or so of the organics that were landfilled were packaged foods. And so this is clearly one of those sticking points. Some are just, we do have a de minimis exception in our law. So, like an individual thing of creamer doesn't have to be, or a pack of, a pat of butter doesn't have to be diverted. But aside from that, there is significant packaged food to be managed and ideally captured and kept out of the landfill as well. In 2019, some of our larger generators, like grocery stores in particular, started trucking some of their food residuals to a depackaging anaerobic digestion facility in Maine. In 2020, our one and only depackaging facility opened in Vermont, in Williston, Vermont, which is in Chittenden County, our sort of most populated county. But currently there's a moratorium on new depackaging facilities. Last year we went through this, that was as of last legislation that passed in the 2022 session, that also formed a depackager stakeholder group, which was a process that we went through last fall. I can share a link out to that and some of the resulting report and recommendations that came from that. But it is really tricky in terms of not, essentially what a lot of the larger generators took this as the depackaging facility opportunity was to outsource that source separation that we talked about at the beginning. And so that is one, not the intent of the law. It also was sort of circumventing some of the higher tiers in our food recovery hierarchy. And some of the haulers were also taking never packaged food and commingling it with packaged food, which essentially just downgrades what is coming out, the resulting output that was going, in our case, goes directly to anaerobic digestion, but could also potentially be going to a compost facility. So we sort of felt like we needed to put the brakes on there as a state and get some more data, get some more research done around microplastics and PFAS in the food waste, which is happening at the state level through an EPA grant currently that's just getting underway. The idea that a lot of those contaminants come from trying to manage packaged food. And then we are expecting, there's a new draft policy that is available already that we've provided comments on. The comment period is closed now, but anyone can go on and see what that looks like. And we're anticipating new rules. So rulemaking will start the end of this year, and we think the new rules will likely be formalized by 2024. And so I think that's sort of, there's a whole lot that I could talk about. Happy to answer questions, but in 10, 12 minutes or so, there's your high level overview of sort of what's happening at the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. And yeah, personally, I've learned a lot here, and looking at how many resources Illinois has that we could put towards putting some form of legislation together to move the needle and join other states that have pursued this type of mechanism towards diverting food scraps from the landfill. And so I'm going to turn it over to our executive director, who is going to moderate our question and answer session here. So Sue Stylen, go ahead.
Thank you.
Sue, if I could just interrupt, we do
Sure.
have one more commercial for anybody who arrived late. We have our upcoming webinars. We have webinars each month like this one, so we'll have some more in the fall. They're being planned right now. We do know we'll have the Illinois Recycling Professionals Forum. And then, of course, any other ideas that anybody has, free to submit to us, and those will be planned. And then one last time, I just want to remind everybody that next month, less than a month away, is our annual in-person conference. We're pulling out all the stops this year. We're celebrating the 25th anniversary of our member GDB, who's a paint recycler. And hopefully the passage of paint EPR legislation will also be celebrated. We have 15 educational sessions. We have national speakers. We have experts from across the state as well. We have an awards luncheon, and we have some early sponsors there that you see, and we appreciate all of them, and we welcome all of you to please become a member. Join us, become an attendee at the conference. If you have something that you would like to share with us, be an exhibitor and do that. I'm going to leave it back over to Sue for questions that were in the chat, and then we'll open it up to everybody.
Thank you. And just a reminder, if you do have questions, to please put them in the chat. This first one is with regards to the radius-driven guidelines. Is there any consideration to distances to or from the transfer stations versus distances from the actual generator? And I think that might have happened when Isaac was speaking.
In New Jersey, no, it's only the licensed food waste processing facilities. Now there are some facilities that are not the end place, I would say. So we have a waste management core facility, which takes it and turns it into a slurry that goes to an anaerobic digester. But in terms of transfer stations, those are not really considered within in the law.
Okay, and this next one is for Natasha. Is there a cost to residents for the curbside composting or communal composting drop-off?
Yeah, so for curbside pickup, there were some early programs to get it going that it was essentially offered at fairly low cost, and that was really limited to our more populated towns. And now I don't know of any subsidies on that, and the cost varies by hauler because we have a number of different haulers. It also, so some of the things go into that are, is it shared like at a condominium that has a larger tote, or are you paying for a single household 5-gallon bucket? Are you having it picked up every week or every other week? But what I will share as well is that what folks are realizing over time is that if you're having your food scraps picked up, your trash doesn't smell anymore. And if you're recycling, you don't have as much of much trash as you might have in, before these programs started. And so what a lot of folks tell me is that it's actually been a cost shift. They're having their food scraps maybe picked up weekly. They're having their trash now picked up every other week or monthly. And so it just depends on the household and how people are able to navigate that. In terms of drop off, if you're bringing most of the transfer stations, if you're also bringing trash and recycling, then food scrap drop off is free. But if you are just bringing food scraps, I think it's like $3 or something like that, or $1 in some places. So it's pretty affordable. And then lastly, they're in Brattleboro, which is one of the towns in southern Vermont. Their city actually, municipal body has contracted for the curbside pickup in terms of just in their within the town center. And so there might be some subsidy there, but it also really helps with the outreach and education around contamination. And they have more, so it's a different model than what you see in other towns. So there's a single hauler that does the curbside for residents there.
Okay, and this next one is from Joseph Forth, for anyone. What actions or help from governmental bodies can help food waste reduction? That is, in his department primarily inspects waste facilities to assess their compliance with local and state regulations, but they are trying to get more into developing sustainability programs in Cook County. What can they do to help these programs legislation get off the ground?
Got a couple thoughts on that one. One of the things that we're looking at in New Jersey is, can we provide some sort of small grants to the people who are doing the food waste reduction, so that they have the truck that they need, or the refrigeration they need, or something they may only need a few thousand, maybe even less to do that. But if they could have that program, then it's going to help them work with the generators to be able to rescue that food rather than recycle it or put it in the trash. Another thing we focus on is schools. One of the things that we found to be really effective there is share tables, which is an opportunity where you give out all this food, and sometimes it's either believed to be mandated or actually mandated, and the kids don't want to eat it. And so what they'll do is they will put a table out where you can deposit this food. It might be a full thing of milk, it might be an untouched apple, it might be all different types of things. And then they'll either give it out as something that the kids can take home, for a snack, or there's they'll donate it to a food bank. Those are just a couple different ways. There's a lot of different things that people are working on. The state has created, guidelines for K through 12 on how to reduce food waste, that you could certainly look at here in New Jersey, and I could send your way. But those are just a few ideas.
And this is Ben with Compost Crew. So we've done entire webinars just on this question. So, probably too much to cover in a simple question and answer. But I think in short, we've had a lot of success just helping municipalities and counties start with something, anything, to start with to inspire behavior change. So, for example, a municipality might be thinking, well, I have 1 million residents, I have to start a curbside collection program for everybody, and they never get anything off the ground. So instead, a municipality can start with a drop-off program with 5 65-gallon bins at a community garden, just to get some type of food waste diversion going. And then that 5 bins goes into 10 bins, then 15 bins, and then it turns into a curbside collection program. So just utilize a lot of procurement guidelines allow municipalities to do pilot programs under a certain amount. Just start a food waste drop-off program in that within your procurement guidelines. very simple, and then it builds momentum.
I think the other really brief comment that might be helpful is identify who your allies are, really. You know, sometimes there's a recycling coordinator, sometimes there's someone with sustainability in their title, sometimes there's like a citizen green team in the area, and think about how you can leverage the people within government or already connected to government that are interested in this topic already, and get them to help you do the work.
Yeah, and I just shared in chat a website, scrapfoodwaste.org, that our Agency of Natural Resources put together, that does a lot of sort of like public service announcements, social media campaign kind of things. And there's it started really focused on waste reduction and different opportunities for that, including a scrap food waste challenge that just happened this year for the first time. But they've also last year started a clean compost campaign, which focuses on getting the message out around limiting contamination. And so I think having resources like this that the state can provide leadership there, and then municipalities and towns can then utilize some of these materials to help drive the conversation, just to add to what everyone else has already shared.
Okay, well, I don't have any more questions. Do you have any, Marta? She's
Hi, yeah, I thought that was fantastic. I really appreciated this so much. I hope that there's some more folks that are able to ask some questions in the chat, because we have a really great audience for you today. We've been in Illinois working on diversion of organics from our landfills since the late 80s, and we have been trying to strengthen some of the laws, but not always with success. So I guess my question is what tactics you're taking when it comes to getting your state agencies, counties, and municipalities to utilize this. Like I said, we've tried a couple things and so far have not really had a lot of success. So just even trying to get it on our highway systems, things like that.
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
So really it's more like, how do you get your government agencies, your state, your counties, and your municipalities to purchase compost material for use in their projects? And I know several of you mentioned it. You mentioned stormwater, I noticed, and we've tried locally on highways. We've had very limited success, and it hasn't trickled down to our counties and requiring our county highway departments to do things yet. But I think that that's something we could continue to push, but I would love to hear if you're having success.
I think this is something that I touched on briefly, you know, initially, which is you can add provisions to mandatory recycling, to organics legislation that addresses procurement issues. And New Jersey's law did address procurement issues at the same time. You know, but that's sort of at the state level. But then I think it's working with who is setting the specifications for jobs. So whether that's the DOT and someone specific within the DOT, or whether that's local engineers, you know, there's a top-down legislative approach, and then there's, you know, the ground up where you focus on who are creating the spec sheets and getting compost spec'd in the right way.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, I spoke recently with the Assistant Commissioner of Planning, Multimodal, and Grants Administration for our Department of Transportation. And I mentioned to him the, you know, requirement within the food scraps law. And he had no idea. So, you know, you can pass the law, but your work doesn't end there. You still have to make sure that, you know, the people who are going to implement the law really know what it it's going to take. And now this guy, generally, would he be involved in that particular, thing? Probably not, but you have to make sure the right people who are, putting out those bid specs that Matt was talking about and whatever, they really know that there is this requirement, and make sure it's implemented.
Yeah, I'll just add to that in Vermont, not that we've had a whole lot of success yet, or something that we're actively working on, but it's through conversations with the folks. Like we just learned I anyway, just learned a couple years ago that one of the holdups there wasn't actually an item number for one of our DOT's projects. So even if a contractor wanted to include compost, there wasn't a number that they could put on their line item to say that that's what they were using. And so we had to go all the way back to work with them to create that. So then that was an option. I mean, it's really under having the conversations, as many conversations as you can with as many different people to understand where things are sort of getting hung up. We also have specifications that are very broad that just sort of say compost, but there's a whole lot of different kinds of compost, and depending on the project and what you're trying to do, especially around stormwater, you want to specify specific qualities in compost, specific nutrient profiles or physical, particle size, structure kinds of things. And so it's a bit more of a nuanced conversation, I think. But one of the things that we were successful on in our stormwater management is we actually got in a soil quality requirement. So in construction projects, disturbed soil needs to be brought up to a minimum of 4% organic matter. And so how are there different ways that you can do that? Well, compost is one of the best ways to do that. But you can only do that through compost if you have the actual numbers to fill out the DOT form or the stormwater form to say that you're using compost. You have to understand what 4% organic matter even means and how to get there. That was one of the first things after these new regulations passed, was people were like, I don't know what that means. The people who would actually be doing it on the ground. And so helping people understand, is that an inch of compost that you then, till in? Is it how do you get there? And so we started in partnership with our state stormwater folks, providing that kind of outreach and education to bring the contractors up to speed in terms of what does it mean to implement it? And like was said, you can have these laws, you can have these rules and regulations, but if folks don't know what that means, or if there aren't the right specifications, it's very hard to on the implementation side of things. And then I'll also just say that we've done some demonstration sites, which is really helpful to have, to bring everybody, your stormwater folks, your DOT folks, your legislators, if you can get them there, your contractors, the engineers, whoever there, to actually see some of these compost-based practices in action, and that they can work, and often can work better than standard operating. So it's an iterative conversation for sure.
Last thing I'd add is, it doesn't always have to be a law. There can be other programs that support compost production. So for example, the Office of Agriculture of one of the counties around here purchases a set amount of compost that they then distribute to farmers for free each year. So that helps build guaranteed offtake for some of the compost producers.
Nice.
Okay, I have another question, and that's, at what threshold do you feel that you have sufficient processing capacity to implement a ban? That's to anyone.
I don't know what other folks will think, but I talked specifically about our lack of infrastructure here in New Jersey, and yet I think the sufficient processing capacity is 0. You have, the caveats in all of these bans that, if there's not a facility, then you can be exempt, right? But if you pass the bill, that gives an incentive for facilities to open up. And it also, highlights some of the issues, I would say, with your processes, right? So we have somebody who wanted to open up a facility, and they knew that, one of the things they had going for them was this ban, but they ran into challenges. And now we can sort of work on those challenges to help them and future facilities start to open. So if you think that like you're going to pass this ban and then suddenly everything's going to change, then maybe you'll be a little disappointed. But from my perspective, yes, there's a lot that we need to do. I still wouldn't go ahead and say, no, we shouldn't have implemented the ban.
I agree completely. And Vermont has actually been fairly successful at having our law drive the infrastructure. Are there still issues? Are there still capacity challenges and different, it's always going to be complex, but you just have to get started. And that's the only way to really figure out what else is missing or what needs to be tweaked in a process that you had thought through, because until it becomes concrete, there's really no way to anticipate everything that might come up. But you get started and you do it. And if sites if you don't have enough capacity, there are often these, like willing and able to take the material, and it builds it out, right? It builds over time. So I think Vermont's sort of, it was a 6-year rollout of our law really gave us time to figure some of these things out, even with a number of missteps or, 2-step forward, 3-step back kind of dance happening throughout those 6 years.
I think, we're a for-profit company and looking to invest private dollars into more composting, both on the collection side and the processing side. And so I think what Isaac and Natasha said is right. It's how immediate do you want the impact to be? But you have timelines, and if there's sufficient time, the bill will go into effect at a certain date. So hopefully there will be infrastructure that will be built by that date so that there will be immediate diversion. But even if it's not, there's still incentive for private companies like us to build additional capacity after the fact. And so it does definitely impact our behavior. I mean, we're looking at Maryland, we're looking at other places that need additional infrastructure as a result of bills like this. So it definitely makes an impact. So I don't think that there's necessarily a magic number or magic threshold. It's just how immediate do you want the diversion and impact to be?
Okay. And this is for New Jersey, Maryland, and Vermont. How do you promote composting in schools?
So for Maryland in 2022, our General Assembly passed a law establishing a grant program. This is for both composting as well as food waste reduction. It did not include any funding, but in the 2023 budget, there is now funding. Before this, all of the food waste and composting efforts in public schools have been largely supported on a individual school by school basis. So there's a group of students in Montgomery County and a couple of other counties getting these programs off the ground in their individual schools. And then there is a really cool program based out in Frederick called Lunch Out of Landfills that's first started working with the Rotary Club, and then now their county government in Frederick County has been funding it as well.
Yeah, I'll just say for Vermont, it's definitely something that we're promoting. There is definitely some technical support from the state, but also through our master composter program. A lot of our master composters are very engaged in the school system and helping get those compost programs up and going. Many of our schools, well, I don't know about many, but there are a proportion of our schools that basically produce too much. So they're they're managing a portion of their food scraps on site, and it's integrated into the curriculum. And then they're still having a portion of it hauled to a compost facility. So it's sort of a combination thing. And then our solid waste management districts, which is how Vermont sort of carves up. I didn't show that map, but it's this weird patchwork of broader solid waste management in our state. Most of those districts have outreach and education coordinators that are also very engaged in supporting school composting. And we now have sort of a coalition that is supporting, they're just starting this year through a supervisory union. There's going to be 24 schools of part of this program that are going to receive technical training as well as stipends to help support build infrastructure for on-site composting at schools. And that includes training for all of the school staff as well as curriculum to integrate into classrooms. And so thinking of it as a full package and everything that you can teach through composting, even if it's not directly related to composting, is, I think, really has been really helpful and engages schools on a different level than just, you have to now do this.
Yeah, I'll add, in New Jersey, we have one of the first comprehensive climate change in the curriculum legislation. And so that's not specifically about composting, but we're hoping that, you know, they won't forget us. And that's one of the things that we're gonna work on, is making sure that happens. We also have a great organization called Sustainable Jersey for Schools, which provides points for all different types of activities. And then we have our private members who are working, you know, with different schools and things like that on a school-to-school basis. Yeah, to really get out the word.
Okay, and I think this is going to be our last one. We heard the number of collectors jumped dramatically in Vermont. Has this happened in New Jersey or Maryland?
So in New Jersey, from when we started as an organization, there have been a lot more collectors. Really, the only company that I knew that was doing much of anything was coming to your backyard and composting for you. Now there is a little more infrastructure, including you know, an AD facility which opened since then. And so we've seen a lot more haulers, but again, the lack of infrastructure has sort of limited that to some degree. But yeah, we've seen a lot more activity. Now, has that been directly tied to these laws? Again, I mentioned at least one county that we can say pretty definitively is tied to that. But you know, we think that'll be more in the future.
Too early to tell with Maryland. You know, anecdotally, I can say that nothing much has changed. I think seems like there's more companies sniffing around, but it's too early to tell.
And I'll just add, in Vermont, we've seen so many iterations. There was this boom of really small companies, and then some have gone out of business, and others have been actually absorbed by some of our larger haulers, or you know, but still sort of that's like their food scrap division of their, you know, of haulers that were doing more trash and recycling. So I think this is something that evolves, and what it looks like will likely change over time. But I will also just add that the pandemic actually really helped us. There are a number of small residential haulers that lost their jobs during the pandemic. And after a few months of sitting around, they're like, well, this ban went into place anyway for residents. What can we do? And they started their own businesses and are successful enough that they're not, you know, it was it was a whole employment change for them, and they're sticking with it. So, and have been really successful. And so I think it can be seen really as an entrepreneurial opportunity once it's clear that some of the demand is there that's really driven by the laws. So, yeah.
I certainly want to join John in thanking each of you for being here today and sharing your expertise and knowledge and experience with all of us. And I know that we had a good attendance, but we'll also be saving this, and it has been recorded. So it will be available on our website shortly. And by shortly, I usually mean a week or two. So, but it will get there. And I'm sure more people will be viewing it because not everybody has a chance to take a break from their day to be here. But I appreciate all of you doing that. And thank you so much. We will bring this to a close. And if anybody has any questions, if they did not catch your contact information, they can just email us at illinoisrecycles.org, and we will make sure that they get your contact information.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right,
so much.
thanks
Thanks.
all.
Thank you.
Bye.